Okay.
Yeah, let's. We're probably going to have some people hop on here as we're going along here, but for everybody else that came in, um, guys, I really appreciate all of you coming into this webinar today. Taking your precious time to really invest in some good educational information. We're very thankful to you, Cale Bigelow, for being our presenter today and sharing information with us. So go ahead and teach on, if you will, whenever
All
you're ready
right.
here.
So we'll open the conversation and talk a little bit about sustainability for a few minutes, and then some of the things that I've been thinking as far as preparations for winter, primarily related to cool season grasses. The whole warm season grass would be that'd be another 45 minutes or an hour. So we're going to focus on the cool season grasses. So I'm good to go then, Katie. You got everything recording and we're square. Is that correct?
That's correct. Go on ahead.
Is Katie still around?
I
Okay,
am. Can you
let's
hear
move
me?
on. Okay, yes, I can hear you. All right, slide number 2. There we go. This is talking a little bit about sustainability in simple terms. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort to pick up something to hear about sustainability in any sort of industry at this point, whether it's sustainable energy, sustainable business models. Certainly where I work in the College of Agriculture, we talk quite a bit about sustainable agricultural systems and what that might entail. There are a number of different definitions if you look them up in terms of sustainability, but on the environmental side, if you go to dictionary.com right there on your mobile device or laptop, you're going to get the quality of not being harmful to the environment or depleting natural resources and thereby supporting long-term ecological balance. You got somebody tuning a guitar in the background. But in reality, I think it's much more broad than that. And when I think about sustainability, I think of some people talk about the three-legged stool or the 3 E's. Basically, you're looking at the environment, economics, and equity. Basically, with the environment, that's something certainly the green industry is very aware of and thinks quite a bit about is, what can we do to protect the environment? How are we using our resources? Are we using those resources in a responsible manner to make sure that we're not harming things? When we're thinking about, the business of golf or the business of lawn care or anything related to the green industry, certainly we want to make decisions with our programs, with our people, with all the resources that we have at our disposal to make sure that we're prosperous economically and that our business survives. So that's a piece of it as well. And then the other one that's a little bit harder for some people to get their arms around is the whole idea of the social responsibility or the equity in terms of what you're doing and making sure that you're doing things in a sustainable manner for future generations and also for things that are happening immediately around us. So I look at it from the 3 E's, not just the environmental perspective, and a lot of people do just kind of look at it from the environmental perspective, but all those other themes are lying underneath the surface there and interconnect and make this thing that we call sustainability. Next thing here, why would you be interested in sustainability? Certainly, last 5 or 6 years in many industries, particularly the golf industry, people have had to really concentrate on things like resource efficiency, operational efficiencies in terms of, can you get things done quicker? And a lot of people have rethought, everything from, their fertilizer programs, their fungicide programs, to the fuel that they're putting in different pieces of equipment, to the types of people that they're hiring. So that's a part of the sustainability aspect, and obviously those tie right into the economics. From the environmental side of things, are you doing things at your facility to encourage more diversity, ecological diversity? Are you creating habitats for, maybe some of the critters that are, finding your location and deciding that that's going to be their home? Those are important things. Having a diverse ecological habitat is an important part of it. Ultimately, the game of golf is played on grass. And if we're being responsible with our resources, we can improve playing conditions. One of the obvious ones is people have changed the way that they're watering golf courses these days. People are using some of those moisture meters and really more concerned about firmness than they were in recent years. And I think that has improved the playability of the golf courses. And so that's an important part of it as well. I was recently visiting with someone that was at a residential golf course, and the individual that was there was told by the owner that green sells. Make sure that this thing is just don't worry so much about the playing conditions. Just make sure that it's green, and that's difficult to sustain that for the long term, because if you lose sight of the playing conditions, the golf course would eventually suffer, and people aren't going to come to the cash register anymore. So that's a piece of it as well. This is something that I certainly am working on in terms of trying to educate people that the greenest lawn isn't necessarily the healthiest lawn, the greenest golf course isn't necessarily the healthiest golf course, the greenest sports field isn't necessarily the healthiest sports field. So that's a part of it as well. And as we look at sustainable practices, that's going to be part of it as well. The last two here: reduced liability for the facility and a better working environment, better employee morale. Certainly, when we're dealing with pesticides, we want to be as responsible as possible with those kinds of things, using them sparingly or only when necessary. And that's going to be helpful in terms of any sort of pesticide review boards, or the types of things, the regulations that we oftentimes face in the golf course industry with respect to the pesticides that we use. Less pesticides you use, the better off you are in terms of not having some of these issues if something were to go not the way that you want them to. And then the last bit here about a better working environment, better employee morale. If you communicate your sustainable vision well, I think that the people that are working for you are going to take pride in that. They're going to help you along in terms of the sustainability goals. They're going to take some pride in the idea of doing the right things for lots of little reasons if you're communicated properly. So lots of benefits to a sustainable mindset. Next thing here, these are a number of different golf courses in the UK. Some of them may be a little more familiar than others, but oftentimes when we talk about golf course management outside the United States, it's very, very different. And typically, if you talk to people that are managing facilities in that part of the world, oftentimes they're using much fewer resources than we do here in the United States. And some people talk about these reduced inputs, and they sometimes look at these and they hold them up on a pedestal, and they talk about them being quote unquote more sustainable. But I want to get to sort of the next point of that, and why that actually might be the way it is an example of that is what's happened in Denmark in the last 10 years. In 1997, the Danish government came in, and they had a very, very strong focus on protecting the country's groundwater, and they were interested in eradicating all pesticides from basically sports fields, any public lands, golf courses, and things like that, and they were going to phase it in over a number of years. And you get to this what I spoke about just a moment ago, where the European golf courses are quote unquote more sustainable, less resources, less inputs. Well, part of it is, in some situations they've been mandated to be in those types of situations, so they're having to do, do the best they can with very little resources. And whether that's sustainable or not, I don't know. But the reality is, as we look at what happens around the globe, and we are in a global marketplace, other people take notice of this, and the point and part of this webinar is, making sure that, as Americans and the Americans that are managing golf courses, that we're being proactive in case these kinds of things were to come to your facility. It was an interesting article if you get a chance to read it. It's about 6 years old now, but there was a nice big thick article that Golf Digest published, and John Barton had put this together, and the title of the article was "How Green is Golf?" And in that article, he interviewed a whole bunch of different influential people to the game of golf, and asked a number of pointed questions and got some information. And it was, I think, intended to create some awareness to the golf industry. And we oftentimes have been criticized ever since golf has been around here in the United States for using too much water, using too much fertilizer, using too many pesticides, creating situations that people are at risk. And you know, if you, like I said, if you get a chance to read that article or you want a copy of it, I have a PDF copy of it. I'd be happy to share that with you. But there's a lot of good food for thought in there. And what's interesting is, you know, the timing of the article, 2008, right before the crash, the economic crash here in the United States, where in some ways we've actually had to, quote unquote, become more sustainable. You know, primarily due to some of the economic issues that some facilities have experienced in recent years. But it's a good article and brings up a lot of good points of where we might be headed in terms of sustainability in the golf industry. I think that, you know, along those lines, our governing bodies for the game of golf, you know, the folks that are running the championships, the United States Golf Association, and you know, the PGA of America, they've recognized that, you know, we've got some challenges here in the United States as well. Not only from public perception, but also in terms of survivability of some of the facilities that we have here in the United States. But you know, when you look at it from the environmental side of things, and you look at the resources that we have to use, you know, the USGA, you know, took a pretty strong stance on this, and you'll see this continue to get rolled out over the next several U.S. Opens. But you know, they're taking the idea of you know, the water issue that we're having, and trying to help the public to understand that, you know, the greenest surface isn't necessarily the most playable surface. And I think that eventually that message is gonna take you know, take hold with some people, and they're going to understand why, you know, some golf course managers are managing the facility the way that they do. That, you know, it doesn't have to be green, you know, 24/7, 365 days a year. But you know, water is obviously a huge issue. You know, this part of the United States where I am in Indiana, all the way to the East Coast, it's not as chronic as it is as what's happening out west right now, but it is something we all need to be very, very conscious of. Not only from, you know, watering our plants to provide the surfaces that we're looking for, but also we need to be thinking a little bit about you know, what's going to happen in terms of water quality as well. And you know, people are going to point fingers back to us as a green industry when there's some declines in water quality. So all those things tie in there. Next slide here. You know, and my point with this is, you know, there are things that continue to evolve in terms of organizations and groups that are out there to help us as an industry, the golf industry, in terms of trying to get our message out. You know, there's a lot of facilities that are already doing a lot of very good things in terms of their practices, and it's just a matter of being able to market those things and document those things and get that information into the right people's hands. But you know, keeping a focus on these 3 E's, not just the environment, but you know, how is what you're doing potentially, you know, helping the bottom line, and then, you know, how is what you're doing potentially helping, you know, the surrounding community. I would not be surprised at all over the next 10 or 15 years that we get more and more regulations, you know, in the golf course industry, and so the folks that are managing golf courses today are certainly need to be forward thinking and be ready to adapt if and when that becomes necessary. Next part of this is just, you know, a couple examples of some things that are out there, some resources that are available. There is you know, a category in Europe, and there are courses in the United States that are also what they call GEO certified, and there's this organization, the Golf Environment. You know, it's geo.org. You can find them on social media. You can also find them on the web. But they have a nice little tool to track your sustainability practices at your facility and to help you, you know, to work towards something maybe that has some reduced inputs while still maintaining the quality playing conditions that your golfers are expecting. So you can go to that website, and what you'll find is their on-course program, and basically this is a computer program where you input a bunch of information, and it allows you to start to document what you're doing and how it's beneficial in terms of this this bigger sustainable message that the game of golf is trying to communicate with the public. So I won't bore you to death with the details on that, but there are a few slides related to what that program is all about. I forget exactly how many clubs here in the United States are participating in this, but you can see this map here. There's probably about 36 clubs throughout the United States in a lot of different growing environments that have signed up and are using this on-course software program that the GEO is is publicizing. There's some other resources as well, from the GCSA and a few other organizations. Audubon International, they have some programs as well. But the thing is, most people are probably already doing a lot of these things. It's just a matter of documenting it and getting it into the public's hands to understand that, just because you're going out there with a fertilizer spreader doesn't mean that you're over fertilizing or applying excess fertilizer. You're probably doing it for a specific reason, and the bottom line is trying to create a nice healthy surface for them to continue to use. The other thing that I would challenge people as they start to talk about sustainability is the idea of really sitting back. We're going to eventually, another 6 weeks, at least in the region that I live in here, this cool, humid region, people are going to have a little bit more time on their hands. It's a nice time to reflect on what you did in 2014 and start to think forward to possibly what's going to happen in the next couple of years as far as your facility. Think about it, and are there places that you can be more efficient? There might be some aspects of your organization maybe you're not as efficient, and maybe there's some things that it's just you're as lean as you're going to get. But I think if we really truly looked at all the different things very critically, there's probably a few places that we can reduce what we're doing in terms of maintenance intensity. Not simply just not maintaining something, but looking at the maintenance intensity and trying to do what's right, for the plant, for the game, and also for the environment, and ultimately your bottom line at your facility. I think the other thing, and this has been a guiding principle for me for a number of years, is not being afraid to challenge the norm. Many of us have learned from people that we've worked for the agronomic practices that we use. Many of us have talked to colleagues that are in the industry, and a lot of people still have some textbook methods for how they maintain things. But don't ever be afraid to try something different. You don't necessarily have to try it on your entire facility, but maybe you take 1 or 2 putting greens and you have sort of this idea of maybe how you can produce the same conditions with a few less inputs. Don't be afraid to give those a try, because you might be surprised what you'll actually find. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave it for the sustainability part of it. Any questions on that? All right, Katie, I'll keep going.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, you guys are sitting there reading magazines, I bet. The next thing that I want to just touch on, and this is the the real meat of this, is the idea of preparing for this year's winter. I've been watching this certainly since the spring, and the last couple of weeks it's not been real high on everybody's radar because it's just been pretty warm and sticky in this part of the United States. But the reality is there's going to be some bad weather ahead over the next couple months. It's just a matter of how severe is this actually going to be. We had some of the worst winter weather in 38 years here in West Lafayette, and what I'm seeing in terms of predictions for 2015 aren't exactly rosy. Farmer's Almanac came out a couple weeks ago, and you may have seen this graphic for the 2015 Farmer's Almanac, and they're talking, at least where I live, stinging and normal snowfall. So we get about 20 inches of snow here in West Lafayette, but the stinging temperatures, not something I'm looking forward to. So we have to be very, very careful and make sure that we're preparing properly for those types of events. I go back to a story that I remember as a child, and certainly shared with my children as they've been growing up. This idea of the grasshopper and the ant, and those of you that are familiar with this, and it's a good parallel for the golf course manager in preparing for the winter. But if you're like the grasshopper and you sit around and wait for winter to come before you prepare, you're going to be very ill prepared, and you're going to be probably knocking on somebody else's door to help you, or you might be knocking on somebody else's door because when you come out of that winter, perhaps the facility is not in a condition that you would be securing your job. So if you need some light reading or something to watch on YouTube over the weekend, The Grasshopper and the Ant, I would encourage that. You guys will be right there, right? Absolutely. The other thing about preparing for winter is everybody has specific things that they need to do to kind of put things away put them to bed at the end of the year. But I think that some weaknesses in people's facilities really showed themselves this past year with the very difficult winter that most of the United States experienced, and there's a lot of lessons to be taken from there. And again, most of the grass, with the exception of maybe some disease things that snuck up on some people here in the last couple of weeks, is relatively healthy this year. We had a mild summer for the most part, and those difficult conditions in March, April, May for people coming out of winter dormancy might be a very, very distant memory. But again, our memories sometimes are very, very short. Last night was the opening of the NFL season, and those teams that didn't do very well last year, that's behind them. That's kind of it's what have you done for me today? So if these teams are able to win going forward, that's a good thing. And then if they had a poor season last year, that goes away very, very quickly. But we certainly do live in the golf industry, what have you done for me lately type of business. So staying on your toes, learning your lessons from what happened, and going forward is really important here. The other thing that is really exciting to me is what we have in terms of resources and collegial resources in terms of social media. And if you don't follow social media, I would encourage you to. But Adam Garr is one person that I certainly follow. Steve Cook up at Oakland Hills is another individual that I follow. And those folks a little north of here had some very difficult conditions with their annual bluegrass putting greens and coming out of winter. So staying informed and being able to react to those kinds of things is a nice advantage of social media. In addition, there are a lot of web-based resources. This was an article written by Jim Scrolos. I can never pronounce Ski's last name, so I'm not even going to try. But it's funny, he wrote that, it was published on September 18th of 2013. Last year, and it said now is the time to begin winter preparations. I think little did he know how difficult things actually would be when he wrote that article, but these kinds of resources, certainly from the agronomists, with the USGA, and there's a lot of other great resources out there, are nice to sort of break out and flip through and underline a few things and see if they apply to your particular situation. But they didn't just pull this out of their brains. They actually think about these things quite a bit before they start writing them. So there might be some things that you can pull out of there and help you in terms of this planning process if you had some difficult conditions coming out of winter. The other piece of this, and again, social media-wise, and my counterpart just north of me is Dr. Kevin Frank. He had an exciting, February and March in the state of Michigan. And basically, Chicago over to Detroit, over to Toronto, the whole snow belt there was really, really difficult for people this past year. So lots of lessons learned there. Some pretty obvious, some maybe a little bit more subtle. But you can see some of the images there that Kevin was posting through February and March of this past year. It wasn't pretty all the way up through April. A lot of things were not very pretty for a lot of people managing golf courses. But still comes back to people that experienced the most damage from the difficult winter were those that probably pushed things a little too hard late in the season. Other pieces of this, and this was one of Kevin's last tweets there that he put out the latter part of March, early April, was bottom line about winter kill, whether it was ice sheets or crown hydration injury. Lots of injury on annual bluegrass or POA. For the most part, bent grass was okay. In some of my conversations with Kevin, he started to get a little sensitive that people started thinking of him like the Grim Reaper when he showed up, because usually if he was showing up at your golf course, you had some dead turf. So he didn't care for that a whole lot, but I think he's over it at this point. What are some of the major reasons that people experienced winter kill this past year? Well, number one is we definitely have some species that are more sensitive to winter conditions on the golf course. Our grasses like annual bluegrass are going to be the most sensitive to winter issues. Creeping bentgrass, Kentucky bluegrass, a little bit less sensitive to those kinds of things. I've even heard some situations where people in the far northern parts of the United States, rough stalk bluegrass can be something that will tolerate winter conditions pretty well. So if you've got annual bluegrass and high populations of annual bluegrass, and you have to continue to maintain that grass, it's something to have a very, very strong conversation with whoever's paying the bills with, because there's some bent grasses that are outstanding in my mind these days, and that's going to help you in terms of being a more sustainable type of facility and not worrying about these winter kill issues quite as much. Some other obvious things: extended exposure to low temperatures, extremely low temperatures we experienced this past year, wind desiccation, lack of soil moisture issues, certainly covering things up late in the season for snow mold. That's going to help in terms of spring playability. And then the big thing that we hadn't seen in decades, was these very thick ice layers that people experienced. And again, annual bluegrass is going to be more sensitive to those types of situations than the grasses like creeping bentgrass. So the next piece here, and we'll go through this and talk about some cultural kinds of things, but bottom line is what kind of things can you do as far as preparation? And for the hipsters in the audience like Matthew and Katie, they're probably already on this Meghan Trainor music that we're hearing on the radio the last couple weeks. Students have introduced me to this. My children in my house have introduced me to this. If you haven't listened to it, God bless you. But she talks about it being all about that base for the what's important in her world. But when we talk about how we're trying to promote winter survival, we need to be thinking about the plant. It's all about, come on slide, you can move to the next bit here. It's all about carbohydrates, and we need to be thinking about what are the basic kinds of practices that we can incorporate into our programs to try and promote carbohydrates. We'll talk a little bit about some of those things, but the bottom line is, physiologically, as the plant's starting to prepare for winter, these shorter days, and again, each day is getting a little shorter all the way to December 21st at this point. Starting to, certainly over the next week, we're going to see some decreases in soil temperatures. These are signals for the plant that, hey, it's time to be that ant in the grasshopper and the ant story and start to try and store some things for winter. So if we can do some things to try and maximize those carbohydrates, that's a very, very good thing. So physiologically, as the plant is going into these types of situations, again, we're trying to do practices that are going to allow the plant to maximize those carbohydrate storage. Basically, any sort of accumulation of carbohydrates in crowns, stems, sometimes even in the root tissue is a good thing. Not pushing a lot of growth, things that would injure the plant and have to cause the plant to recover. All those kinds of things we need to be really, really thinking about each individual thing that we're doing basically for the next 6 weeks in terms of maximizing carbohydrates. So again, we get into, what are these things, what are these basic types of practices that you can do? Again, it comes back to having a plan. Some of the things that are obvious here is if the plant needs to photosynthesize, it needs sunlight. If you have growing environments that are shading the plant, that's not going to be a good thing. All grasses prefer to grow in full sun situations. If you can maximize sunlight, you can maximize photosynthesis. If you can't maximize photosynthesis, or you can't maximize the sunlight that the plant's getting, you have to be a little bit more delicate with it as it's going forward. The other piece of this, that's the above ground part, the sunlight part, but the soil environment, that's extremely important. Are there limitations there? Are there issues in terms of the chemical properties of the soil? Are there deficiencies in certain nutrients? Are there physical properties that maybe aren't ideal for growing the turfgrass plant? Anything related to that is going to limit your ability to store carbohydrates, so you need to be thinking about some of those kinds of things. And then the thing that I think that showed up for a lot of people was these acute soil wetness issues, these drainage swales and things that maybe need to be addressed going forward into the winter of 2015. But again, we sort of come back to this idea of having a solid foundation of your agronomic plan, actually sitting down, writing that plan out, thinking about how you're going to be able to implement that plan, and then that's going to give you the nice strong base and foundation for going into those winter months. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific things that we might have on our plan. So first, where we might want to start is, again, evaluating growing environments, and that's something that most people that have been in a facility for a little while, they have a pretty good sense for, but there are some interesting tools out there for tracking things like number of hours of sunlight. You could do some things even with some apps for your mobile device, your telephone, and you can do that fairly quickly in the field. Are there things that maybe you kind of got bit by this past winter that maybe you need to adjust going into this coming winter? Simple cultural practices like, maybe not getting too aggressive for that end of the year tournament that you got aggressive for last year. Maybe looking at different types of mowing equipment that maybe is not quite as heavy on some of those more sensitive turf areas. Maybe not mowing every single day, going into those mowing and rolling alternating types of patterns to try and reduce the injury to the turf grass plant to allow it to not have to recover from the injury quite as much. Water management, just like in the summertime, it's key at this time of the year too. Trying to keep things a little bit on the drier side. We're not talking dry so it desiccates, but allowing that plant to get into a situation where it's not as succulent, not as lush, and starting to harden off is an important aspect of what you should be looking at in terms of the issues with preparing for winter. Soil drainage, I touched on that. We'll talk about fertility here in a few minutes. Obviously, we're at this time of the year that core aeration programs are pretty important and going to be happening all across the United States. But preparing for winter with your core aeration programs, evaluating what you have and what you haven't done in terms of sand top dressing over the last several years, that's an important aspect of it. I talked about the snow mold, making sure that you're covering things up if you're in a situation that you have you're prone to snow mold outbreaks, or you have a cultivar that's more prone to snow mold outbreaks. I think that's really important. And then in the far northern areas, certainly covers would be a piece of this too. So what do we have in terms of growing environments? The two big limitations here, certainly the shade is not only going to affect things going into the winter months in terms of the ability of that plant to build up all those basic carbohydrates, but the other part of that is the areas that are predisposed to soil wetness, areas that maybe some drainage needs to be put in, and one of the areas that a lot of people oftentimes overlook on their putting greens is where the water actually flows off that surface, and we do get these dams that occur right between the interface of the putting surface and the collar. For lots of reasons over the years, it's not uncommon that lip builds up at those bottom areas, where top dressing sometimes accumulates in the collar. Evaluating that if you have a rainstorm here in the near future, and figuring out if there's some ways to try and get that water to move off those surfaces, that's going to help in terms of winter performance on some areas on your putting greens and even in your fairways. Moving forward here, I can't stress this enough. I wrote an article about this with one of my graduate students in 2012, and it was published in Golf Course Management. The economics, and again, it comes back to sustainability, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, the economics between annual bluegrass and creeping bentgrass. I think at the end of the day, you put those grasses down side by side, and even though we have some outstanding facilities with annual bluegrass is a more expensive grass to maintain and manage for lots of reasons. And these next generation of bent grasses that are here presently, and ones that are in testing as we speak, there's some really good things out there. And when you're talking about winter hardiness, creeping bentgrass much better than annual bluegrass. And then you get into all the potential summer problems that you might have with annual bluegrass. It can happen to any cool season grass, particularly the summer of 2012 was very difficult for everybody managing cool season grasses. But at the end of the day, you add up all the little tick marks of which is easier and which is harder. I think you'd be hard to sell me on the idea that it's easier to maintain annual bluegrass consistently throughout an entire growing season compared to creeping bentgrass. Other pieces of this, like I said, the summer issues and certainly the winter issues with annual bluegrass. It's just not a very reliable and persistent surface every single year. We go back to things you could be doing for prepping for the winter. Excuse me. Just saw this tweet the other day. They called it, "And so Plant Health Month begins. Building strong turf now to help winter survive." They're out there and poking holes, trying to create a good soil environment, a good rooting environment, trying to maximize things in terms of getting this plant healthy going into the winter months. And unfortunately, a lot of people sometimes are having to push this practice off a little bit later than maybe they would like due to the schedule at their facility and how the facility is being used. But try and do something, because root growth now is really important, and root growth through the winter and the spring months is going to give you a healthier turf grass. Next one here. The other piece of this, and we'll slowly segue into root zones and top dressing here, but the root zone does matter, and certainly high play areas, tees, landing areas, approaches, putting surfaces. If you can do things in terms of if you can do things in terms of the root zone in the sand, that's going to be a good thing. If you can try and keep that crown as close to the soil surface as possible and not up in a thatch layer that might have accumulated, that's going to be extremely important, because when that plant actually gets up into a thatch layer, it's more susceptible to temperature extremes, and there's more chance for injury in the summer, in the winter, and also even mechanically. Getting into some of the other things, thatch layers. People that haven't been able to take care of the thatch layers as well as they have in the past, that might be something that needs to be addressed. And maybe it's a time, if you haven't done it for economic reasons in recent years, maybe it's time to send off some things to one of the soil testing labs, not only just for chemical properties, but to evaluate some of these layers and try and figure out if that's something that needs to be managed in terms of coring and sand top dressing. But any of those things is certainly going to help the overall turf health, and a good thing to be thinking about. Not only coring, but certainly in terms of sand top dressing, firmer surfaces, drier surfaces, all those are going to be important things. Looking through some of the suggestions by some of the agronomists throughout the United States, they suggested somewhere around 100 to 200 pounds of dry sand per 1,000 square feet across the autumn months is an appropriate way to take care of that. Back in the quote-unquote old days, some people would actually top dress very heavily, like you see there on the bottom right of this slide, sort of late in the season, just to try and make sure that the turf has something to insulate it going into the winter months. So that's part of that as well. But the other piece in the caveat here is once you do apply that sand, depending upon the time of the year and the soil moisture, you have to be very, very careful with what you do to that sand on the surface, because if you don't do the right things in terms of trying to take care of that sand, you can actually injure that turfgrass plant, and brushing and dragging may not be appropriate. So pay very, very close attention to those rates, and be very, very careful in terms of any mechanical damage that might be inflicted with that as well. So dry sand is certainly going to help in terms of getting it down. The other piece of this that I've seen in some of our research plots and encourage people to be careful with is there are people that stick with their plant growth regulator programs a little bit later in the season, and if you are on a plant growth regulator, perhaps for POA suppression, be careful with those sand rates, because you may end up with some situations where that sand sits on the surface. As far as other major things to be thinking about, mowing practices. At this time of the year, chasing green speed, as we get into the autumn months, you got to be a little bit more careful with that. Again, thinking about how mowing affects carbohydrate status of the plant. The closer you mow, the less carbohydrates the plant's able to produce. And so, as you start to move towards, the end of October, end of October, perhaps a little higher mowing height, perhaps a little less frequent. Those kinds of things can really help in terms of preparing that plant for, very important in terms of preparing that plant for the winter months. I see a quick comment here from, it's not Ann, it's Ann's husband. He says, in New England, it's common practice to top dress with a 70-30% peat mix. I have seen shallow-rooted greens that have been anaerobic. So I guess is the question there maybe not to use a peat mix? Is that what I'm trying to understand there, Mike? Is that what you're saying? I'll see if Mike's out there. I'll type in something. Maybe he's not paying attention to me anymore. Any fix suggestions?
All right. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's good. This is something new to me, Cal, and we know my background is more turf and ornamental than golf, and so I've been learning the golf end of the equation as we're going along, and it's been a fun ride. But the one thing that I've noticed up in New England, they're big on doing things the way they did them 50 years ago, and they're doing a lot of top dressing up in the New England area with peat at a 30% part of the mixture and sand at 70%. And I'm finding the greens to be very layered and mottled. I'm finding them on the many instances to be very shallow and very anaerobic, where they're not breathing at all, and I'm seeing a lot of algae sitting on top of those greens. And from me looking from the outside in, it's like, well, why are we putting down so much peat? It can't be that good for the plants. And they said, well, this is how we've always done it. Is that a common practice outside of the New England area, or did I just stumble onto something?
I wouldn't say it's common, but I wouldn't say that it would surprise me to see someone do that either. But I think, again, that slide that I showed a few back that had that layer at the surface, I would probably base my sand top dressing, my coring program, a little bit on some quantitative data from a physical property testing lab. And in those situations where they're having that problem, they probably need to send something off to a laboratory and figure out how big of an issue this is, because they're going to need to add probably some sand that has a very little amount of peat, if any peat, and really try and dilute that organic layer that's there, because that's going to, like you said, restrict rooting, create stinky conditions. I mean, there's a number of different things that can occur.
Okay, thank you.
But I would encourage them to take a sample, send it to one of the accredited laboratories, and see what comes out. Okay, moving on with the mowing thing, I think that's pretty straightforward. Again, being real careful. There's lots of things that you can do, but don't shoot yourself in the foot. And then the other piece of this that is important is the fertility piece of the whole thing. And so lots of different options with this, and people ask, so what should I do? Should I fertilize going into the winter months? I mean, anything when you take it into general general types of context can be taken out of context. So should I fertilize? And some people might say, well, fertilizing going into winter, the plant's not, getting winter hardiness, and so maybe you shouldn't. The reality is, I think that for our cool season grasses, you talk to anybody that's been in the business or anybody on the academic or consulting side, it's going to be one of those things that you should be fertilizing. So the first easy answer to should I fertilize is yes. The more difficult one is how. There are so many different types of products and so many different types of strategies that it can be kind of confusing for some folks, but we'll kind of go through this a little bit. Katie had a question here, and was that next to the Golf Digest paper?
Yeah, the one you did with your graduate student?
Yep. I'm sorry, that was in GCSA magazine, so Golf Course Superintendents Association of America magazine. I have a PDF copy of that too, if you'd like it, so I can share that with you later.
That'd be awesome. Thanks.
Okay. But in terms of these types of fertility practices, fall nitrogen is a good thing, and it's just a matter of how do you want to actually do this. And like I said, there's probably 10 different ways you can go about this, and with those 10 different ways, probably 9 of them are going to work, and one of them is going to be really, really bad. Maybe it stimulates snow mold, maybe it makes the plant too lush and it can't create the carbohydrates it needs. But I still take a little bit of faith and good feelings with slow and steady being the way to approach this problem. These big pulses of nitrogen are not a great thing. So, see, I got a little graphic there with the tortoise and the hare, but a tortoise approach to feeding the turf in the fall is a more appropriate way to go about this. But again, when we talk about the fertilizer programs, there's so many different nutrients that the plant actually needs, but we're basically going to focus mostly on the nitrogen program, because if you get the plant growing with nitrogen at a nice moderate rate, it's the catalyst for taking up all the other nutrients, and that's going to create good things going going forward. But again, going back to the goal here, applying nitrogen in a controlled manner to not force too much leaf growth, not compromising root growth, and ultimately storing as many carbohydrates as you possibly can. So the way to approach that would be, this time of year, first week of September, we're technically still not even in fall, but, sticking with your summertime program, light fertilization, most likely on putting greens and perhaps on tees, you'd be in some sort of a liquid type of program, using these very, very soluble sources like a urea or something along those lines. Maybe it's a urea with something like a methylene urea type program. Certainly less than a half a pound in any one individual application. If you're on a 7 to 10 day type of program, somewhere between a tenth and a quarter of a pound is probably appropriate. Watching that growth, trying to keep that growth very, very controlled, and that's going to be basically from now, which is the 5th of September, certainly to the beginning, the end of the first week of October. We get questions: are granulars or liquids better or worse? It depends so much on the product, and it also depends on what the needs of the plant are. But what I will say is, with the liquid applications, you're going to be more precise with your rates. So if you can do the liquid applications and do them more frequently, that's going to be one way to feed the plant more steadily through this hardening off period of the late part of the growing season. Late fall, sort of dormant applications, so that would be something that, depending upon where you are geographically in the United States, might be the beginning of November all the way to the beginning of December, but some controlled release nitrogen that time of the year. Generally, that's not going to affect the hardening off process. Big pulses of soluble sources like urea or ammonium sulfate might cause a little bit of shoot growth at that time of the year, and that might not necessarily be something that you're looking forward to, because that can sometimes stimulate some of the diseases like snow mold. And if the plant's not actively growing at that time of the year, it also might be a situation where the nitrogen moves through the soil profile and ends up in the environment where we don't want it to be. So that's not a sustainable turf practice as well. Again, thinking about how you can store carbohydrates is a good thing. In addition to nitrogen, certainly looking at the other nutrients that would be important. Certainly the macronutrients: phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. Doing a soil test, a chemical soil analysis, is not a bad idea, particularly on our sand-based greens that have a lower exchange capacity. That's going to be something, if there are limitations, chemical limitations in the soil, that's going to affect the plant's ability to be healthy going into the winter months, and it might predispose that plant to being more susceptible to winter kill and some of those types of issues. There have been a few studies over the years that have suggested that a 1-to-2 ratio of nitrogen and potassium would result in better winter hardiness. Basically, if you're putting 2 pounds of nitrogen down, you should be putting down 4 pounds of potassium. The information, the research information there is a little bit murky. There are some people that think that the potassium maybe doesn't need to be quite that high. One of the things, again, I come back to all the time is, looking at things like your soil test value. If there's a deficiency in the soil, certainly that ratio is going to help. If there's not a deficiency, if there's an abundance or even moderate amounts of potassium, then there's not going to be quite as much of a need. And again, from a sustainable economic standpoint, but also in terms of being socially and environmentally responsible, those extra fertilizer applications might just sort of be unnecessary, and they're going to affect your bottom line. You're paying for something that the plant actually doesn't need. The next piece of this, and this is the shameless plug for the sponsor of this webinar here, is looking at different things that you should be doing in terms of preparing for the winter months. But I know Holganix has produced this flyer, and there's some good information here. And I think the important part of that is, they've got a fertilizer strategy there of applying some materials the beginning of September, beginning of October, beginning of November, and they've got some sort of a plan and a calendar to try and promote turf health and adding nutrients to try and get that plant as healthy as possible going into the winter months. So you got the plan there on the left-hand side, and if you have some data and some information on the right-hand side, both chemical information and physical information about the condition of the soil growing environment that the plant is growing in, there's a good recipe for some success there. The other piece of this is there's an interesting database that's being generated right now with a couple of organizations. One here in the United States with Pace Turf out in California, and then also with Micah Woods with his Asian Turfgrass Institute in Asia and the Asian golf contingent of golf courses that we have. And basically what they're looking at is they've been collecting a whole bunch of data looking at nutrient needs for turfgrass areas, greens, tees, fairways, rough, different grass species, different growing environments, what people are putting down. And one of the things that we're starting to learn about this is that the turfgrass plant can actually produce very, very good playing conditions on substantially less nutrients than I think we thought it could in prior years. And one of the things that they're advocating with this study and documenting the nutrient uses and needs of golf courses all throughout the planet is trying to get people to look at some of these lower rates for their facility, lower rates on an annual basis. And one of the things that I truly feel as we go to these lower rates, particularly of nitrogen and some of the other macronutrients, for lots of reasons, whether it's regulations or because you're trying to rein some things back in, is that as we start to get to these lower rates of the nutrients, the soil biology is going to become much, much more active in terms of its needs, and if there are deficiencies, some of those things are going to start to show themselves, and that's where products, like the biological supplements, are probably going to show their strongest strength. Because you're going to see these interactions with the biologicals and the nutrients, and enabling people to produce the turf conditions with lower fertilizer inputs because of the biologicals being more active in those types of situations. But again, I don't claim to be an expert in this area. I've got a lot to learn, and we're very, very fortunate that we have some tools now that we can start to measure some of these things a little bit better and get our arms around them a little bit more clearly. One example of this is the use of mycorrhizae, and there are a number of mycorrhizal products that are in the marketplace on all sorts of different types of crops. If you're not familiar with mycorrhizae are a fungus, and basically what the mycorrhizae do, and you can see in this image here, I could even use the highlighter, Katie. Look at that. So you got this guy. Whoop. Maybe I can't. I'm not that skilled. I tried. But what this fungus does is it associates with the root systems, and as it associates with the root systems, there's some synergy here between the plant and the fungus. And basically, what's happening is the fungus is helping that plant to acquire nutrients and water and a number of other things from the soil that the plant's root hairs wouldn't necessarily be able to get to. And basically what this does is it allows the plant to be more efficient in its resource acquisition, and that's a good thing. But one of the things we also know about mycorrhizae, if you look at the research literature, and this is just some information from some research papers a few decades ago as people have been studying the mycorrhizae, is we know that the benefits of mycorrhizae are going to be the greatest in low P soils, soils that have low phosphorus, also in situations where not a lot of phosphorus has been applied. There's been sort of this critical threshold, at least in ag crops, that people have latched onto, is you see more mycorrhizal benefit when soil phosphorus levels are at or below 50 parts per million or 50 milligrams per kilogram. Now I put this other chart on the left-hand side of the slide here because the state of Minnesota, just north of me, was one of the very early folks to start to look at restricting the use of phosphorus in lawns and other turf areas. And if you look at the recommendations for phosphorus in the state of Minnesota, They don't recommend any phosphate be applied to turf areas when the phosphorus soil test value comes back at 25, greater than 25 parts per million. You can apply a half a pound of phosphate. That's basically a quarter pound of actual phosphorus between a soil test value of 11 to 25. And then 1 pound of phosphate can be applied when the soil test value is between 0 and 10. But the important point here is they're talking that threshold being around 50 parts per million is when you're going to start to see benefits. I think in our turf systems, where in many situations throughout the United States phosphorus has been restricted, the mycorrhizal inoculation in the soil could have some very, very strong benefits in terms of the plant being able to access some nutrients that otherwise would not be available in the soil or otherwise cannot be applied to the soil. So lots of good positive things there with the potential of using the biologicals in that type of situation. The other thing I wanted to just talk a little bit about, and I'm going to start to wrap things up here, is we as researchers, and taking our cues from industry and also from colleagues in other aspects of the industry, whether it's the turf grass breeders or the turf breeders, we're looking for systems that can be lower maintenance. And we have some ongoing research here at Purdue. I've got a graduate student attached to a project, and he's evaluating ways that we could have these sustainable lawns without having to add nitrogen fertilization at all. And one way to do that might be to utilize things like grass clover mixes. Some people might think about that as a sort of a forage type of situation, and certainly it's not for a golf course that requires a high level of aesthetics. But it is the kind of thing that, as we look at different areas and look at our resource allocation, is going to be important going into the future. The other piece of this is having different types of plants living together does change the ecology of that soil, does change the ecology of that environment. We're getting a lot of pressure to look at what we are doing and what we aren't doing for pollinators anymore, and so we need to look at some of these other systems and at least be aware of their strengths and limitations. And so when we're asked the question, is there another way to do this in terms of golf maintenance, we can have a very logical and sound answer to that question. I put this picture in here. I was fortunate enough to spend some time in Scotland, and I know one of my friends in the industry. He may or may not actually see this webinar, but he likes the gratuitous livestock images of animals from Scotland. So I put this in here just sort of as a little joke, if you will. But it's a nice landscape. But I also put it in here because, if you recall, we started off very early with the cow that was on the tractor mowing his lawn, and grass going from the lawn right into the cow's mouth, and again, this idea of recycling things on site, but is another fertilized system, if you will, and that is an Angus cow from Angus, Scotland, in case you weren't aware of that. I think for some people that maybe watch this, it looks like dinner. And at the end here, come back that, a lot of what I talked about are very basic types of practices. It is all about the base. It is the type of situation that the foundational agronomic practices, you got to check all those boxes, but you need to look at each of those boxes very carefully and see if there's some things that maybe you can do a little differently in there that would help you to be more successful in 2015 compared to maybe what you had in 2014. And people like myself and people like the vendors that service this industry, we all are in this together, and we want to help each other. So don't ever hesitate to ask questions, or ask the question you think might even be quote unquote the dumb question. And with that, I will leave you on this last slide. We have a home football game here tomorrow against the mighty Central Michigan, and hopefully they will have 100% more wins at Purdue after tomorrow than they had last year. But again, winning solves everything. And last but not least, you're always welcome to drop me an email or send me something on Twitter, and I'll help out as much as I can. That's all I have, Katie.
Cale, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Do we have any questions before we end the webinar?
Cale, hi. This is Rob Tyndall from Holganics. I just was wondering, one thing you mentioned in your slide, talked about some of the better bentgrass varieties, and you really prefer them over a lot of your annual bluegrass varieties. What are a couple of varieties that you favor?
You know, in our trials, and we are just wrapping up the NTEP bentgrass putting green trial that we've had here in place for the last 5 years. Hopefully going to plant the new one on Monday. But, you know, if you go down the list of ones that have performed really, really well, you know, V8 would be on that list for me. There's one called Luminary that would be on that list. 007 would be on that list. There's another one, Declaration, that does well in putting greens, but you got to be a little careful as you get into higher cut turf. Seed Research has a number of nice ones as well. Tyee has done well here. They have one called SR 1150. I've also seen people mix that one with 007. That has done fairly well for some folks. But those are just a handful, you know, 5 or 6 that, you know, seem to have had a pretty good track record over the 5 years of this study. What I haven't had, unfortunately, is we didn't have the fairway trial from 2008, but we will have the fairway and the putting green here going forward. So those would be ones at least to start with.
Okay, good. Appreciate that.
And even, you know, sort of going back a little bit, you know, Penn A1 has done well, you know, in our trials here. I would stay a little bit away from the Penn A4 if you have turf that's prone to dollar spot.
Right, okay.
Okay. What else?
I had another question. You said something about, in one of your slides it said pest against snow mold. Were you saying pesticides to...
I probably was... I'll have to go back and look at that. I have a copy here in front of me. It might have been a typo. It might have been protect against snow mold.
Around 25 or so. I'm just guessing.
Yeah. Let's see what I got here. Is snow mold an issue where you are?
Well, I just had some guys complain about it, you know, speaking about it, of course, after this year. So.
Yeah, we had such an extended period that, you know, if you did not, yeah, pest protection for snow mold, that's what that was. So basically, as I was putting this thing together, you know, any pest protection, certainly for snow mold, you know, doing that late in the season, that also ties in, you know, you'll get into conversations about, you know, if we do have sort of these Indian summers and people have to mow later into the season, they put down their snow mold protection and somebody at the club wants these conditions, playing conditions, and you end up mowing off your fungicide, you know, guarding against some of those kinds of things. But definitely it's on high value putting greens, I'd still be protecting them.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Hey Cale, I got one question for you. You know, to
Sure.
summarize this for everybody here, if you could say the most important thing that a guy really needs to be focused on going into winter, if you'd say absolutely you don't want to not do this, what would that one thing be?
I think it's discount the soil environment in the sense that you know, something in terms of you know, not doing their coring, and then certainly you don't not want to fertilize at least a little bit. And you know, really as we get into, you know, the middle of September, you know, here where we are, I'd say there's about a 30 to 45 day window that some slow and steady feeding. And again, on the chart that you guys are distributing, you sort of have a first week of September, first week of October. Definitely those applications, you know, and then the November application, you know, that's a little bit weather dependent, and you want the plant to be healthy enough to take that application.
This is a question that's a little bit off topic. It has to do with aerification. In professional sports and in some of the sports fields, because they're constant in use and they cannot get on them and pull cores, there's some people that are pushing these new air injection aerification systems out there. What's your feeling on them? Is there some validity to them? Is there a problem that you see that may arise from them? Are you familiar with them?
I have seen them. I've seen one in person, and I do know some people that are using them. I don't think it's a whole lot different than the people that are, you know, having to use or choosing to use the water injection systems during the season. And you know, anything that opens up a hole and doesn't create surface disruption and has the chance to try and you know, grow some particularly cool season grass roots, I'm thumbs up.
Okay.
Now, the other piece of that is, you know, it's one thing to use them, it's another thing to overuse them. You know, it's a lot like what I was talking about with the mowing. There are people that can overmow or overroll. You know, anything that's going to cause mechanical damage, I'm not up for that.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, there's just a lot of these sports turf fields are just overplayed, and they don't get any rest, but they don't have any time to get on top of them to take care of them. So they're just looking at another tool to get out there to reduce some compaction and get some room for the roots to grow. And I've just not had any experience with those units, so I'm cautious.
Well, I think the other advantage to some of those is, you know, for the athletic field folks, they've got these localized areas that they're oftentimes having to spend a lot of time on. You know, it might be sidelines, it might be, you know, these paths where things coming in and out of a stadium. Those are nice tools because they can get in there, usually do things fairly quickly without a whole lot of, you know, surface disruption, meaning cores on the surface and that kind of stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. What else?
All right, I guess, unless anyone has any last questions. Go once, go twice.
3 times.
All right, Cale. On
Okay.
behalf of the entire Holganics team, thank you so much for doing this webinar for us.
Happy to do it.
It's an honor to learn from you, and thank you. Really.
Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing you guys in Louisville, if not sooner.
Yeah, definitely. And anyone who's attending right now, just as a heads up, the PowerPoint presentation will be sent over to you along with a link for the recording. So look for that in your inbox.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, Cale.
Have a good weekend.
All right.
Bye.
I'm going to get off this thing now, okay?
Okay.
Okay, bye.